So the topic tonight or today is the starting premise of that is does facilitation have a role or place in disaster management? Disaster management is often associated with top-down decision-making and directive leadership. Now, if that is the case, it does beg the question, what role does facilitation have in disaster management? And if it does have a role, where and how does that role play out? So that's what we're going to be discussing in this session. To start us off, I'd love to hear from our panel. We've got 4 panelists, and the panel comprises 2 disaster management experts and 2 facilitators who have little or no background in disaster management. So we've essentially got the, in the teal corner, we've got the 2 facilitators, and in the red corner, we've got the 2 disaster management experts. And I'd love to introduce them now. I'm just going to share my screen to so that you can get a bit of a look at them. If you just bear with me. Hopefully you can see the screen there. And our panel members. So Dr. Catherine Lloyd is an experienced facilitator, educator, and creative arts practitioner. She's the author of a wonderful book called Seriously Playful Creativity, which provides an A to Z, literally an A to Z of creativity, and brings creativity to those of us who may feel that we are not particularly creative. She's also co-author of another book called The Story Cookbook. She's the founding director of Maverick Minds and helps individuals, teams and groups find ways to work well through coaching and facilitation. Catherine has a doctorate in creative industries research. She has a global team coaching individual accreditation and is a practicum facilitator with the Global Team Coaching Institute. She's also a member of the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. So welcome, Catherine.
Thank you.
Alongside Catherine is Phil Preston. Phil is a professional speaker and master facilitator, and he helps organisations develop purpose-led and collaborative approaches to solving complex problems for teams, organisations and multi-stakeholder groups. Like Catherine, Phil too is an author. His book, Connecting Profit with Purpose, is a fantastic read. I can highly recommend it. It's really changed the way that I view organisations. So Phil, thank you for being with us.
Yep, great. Thanks for the invite.
In the red corner, we've got Patrick Byrne. Patrick is a former Chief Superintendent in the Scottish Police Force, where he was Head of Criminal Investigations. After arriving in Australia, Patrick joined the Queensland Government as Counter-Terrorism Advisor in the Premier's Department before project managing the implementation of Queensland's new state-of-the-art State Disaster Coordination Centre. As Queensland's Disaster Operations Manager at the State Disaster Coordination Centre, Patrick has managed numerous state-level response and recovery operations to natural disasters. A very experienced operator. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you.
And alongside Patrick is Mike Morrison. Mike is also a former police officer, highly experienced disaster management practitioner, having worked for many years in state and local government disaster management roles in Queensland. To add to his 4 police bravery commendations, Mike's also a recipient of the Emergency Services Medal. He runs his own consultancy in Brisbane, Mike Morrison Consulting, and works obviously out of Brisbane and elsewhere. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you.
I'll stop sharing now, and I might ask, we go to our panelists now, and I might ask our disaster management experts, Mike and Patrick, to tell us a bit about disaster management. What is disaster management? How does it work? And how does it relate to crisis management? Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Graham. Welcome, everyone. Great opportunity to spread the gospel, which is sometimes a difficult one. It's like a train running out of control down mountain to a bridge that's not there. So we just have to bear with us on this. Just to set the scene, disaster management is the same as emergency management. So if you're somewhere else in the world today or somewhere interstate, you'll find that when I talk about disaster management, I'm also talking about emergency management. So just to sort of correlate those two. Queensland's disaster management system is founded on state legislation, the Disaster Management Act of 2003 and the Disaster Management Regulations of 2014. It's supported by a number of different, what I call instruments of the legislation, such as the Disaster Management Guidelines, the state policy, and disaster management standards. The legislation provides us with a what to do approach to disaster management, whereas the instruments provide that how and when approach. So they both feed into each other with the disaster legislation being the parent document in relation to that. Disaster management in Queensland is based on 4 principles, and I think this is a fairly universal approach. The 4 principles being a comprehensive approach, which is based on prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. An all hazards approach, which means the same set of arrangements are applicable to all hazards. So if you have a flood, or if you have a cyclone, or if you have a tsunami or an earthquake, the same set of principles should apply. The third principle is a local disaster management capability. Local government, councils, local municipalities are considered the front line of disaster management in Queensland, as I'm sure they are across the rest of Australia, mainly because they have a connectedness with the community, with the people in the community. They serve the community directly. And the fourth principle is the support from district and state when and if required, providing resources and manpower and a whole range of support systems to local government in the application of their disaster management arrangements. It's important to note that whilst disaster management is predominantly a bottom-up driven approach, there are some events that are top-down driven, and we're starting to realise that things such as the COVID-19 pandemic and mass evacuations are a more of a top-down driven approach. But I'm sure Patrick will talk more about the state relationship with disaster management later on. I was going to share my screen with you, but I don't know how to do that.
Well, look, what we might do, Mike, if I can just ask Patrick, we were talking with Thomas before about crisis management. What's the difference between disaster management and crisis management from your point of view, Patrick?
Sure. Look, the principles of crisis management on paper are very similar to disaster management. And if you look at all the writings and the lectures and the websites and all that kind of thing, they all identify the same points. But frankly, it's a much more interesting field with some really fascinating case studies about how crises have been managed well, or unfortunately, in many occasions, have not been managed well at all. So the difference can be, the fact that they're sudden and significant negative events that are unpredictable or unforeseen, and the crisis management aims to avert that or limit the severity or duration or turn it into an opportunity. So you've seen things like cybercrime paralyzing an organization's systems, through denial of service attack, kidnapping of staff overseas, some kind of particular crisis in the company, that affects it to a really, really significant event. And crises, from my own personal experience, tend to be managed by very, smaller groups. Obviously very key senior figures who are, the top people who are, managing that and working at what to do. And the perception of how that crisis is handled can be almost as important as the event itself. So, some of the really bad examples of crisis management might be that unfortunate one where the Deepwater Horizon one, how it was managed by BP, which might resonate across in Albuquerque. But The CEO of BP subsequently lost his job just on the basis of how badly he handled that and how apparently it was so badly handled. But I think there's probably plenty of opportunities for facilitation within crisis management in terms of practice, preparation, exercising and review. Those sort of fields and opportunities may present opportunities in terms of facilitation. But it's a fascinating field, and I'd certainly recommend reading some of these case studies, which are really good.
Right. Thank you. So, Mike, you were saying before that disaster management is really encapsulated in government legislation and the like. But I'm presuming the from what Patrick was saying, the principles of disaster management and crisis management are similar in as much as something bad has happened. In the case of disaster management, something bad has happened, in case of a lot of natural disasters and the like. And so the whole government machinery then kicks into action. Yeah. You mentioned before about there's the sort of the stages of a disaster. What's a simple sort of model for that?
Look, it's based on prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. Now, in other countries, they have different terms, but I think New Zealand has the 4 R's rather than 2 P's and 2 R's. But it's about being prepared. It's about having strategies in place that prevent something from happening. Now, I'll give you an example of that would be building a road higher so it's not affected by floods. So that's a preventative strategy. Preparation is about the development of plans and exercising of those plans. And response is based on activation of those plans, activation of different groups to respond. And recovery is obviously the recovery from the event.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a before, there's a sort of a during, and there's an after
There's
sort of component.
After, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the question I got, I guess we have is, we're getting a little bit more nuanced now. It's, for many of us, disaster management might be a bit of a mystery, but it looks like disaster management and crisis management deal with unexpected events. And you can do things beforehand, you can do things during, you can do things after. The question, I guess, is where does facilitation fit? And that's what we'll be talking about in our small groups. But it might be nice to bring in our facilitation panel members now to talk about facilitation. Phil and Catherine, how do you use facilitation in your work, and how would you describe facilitation?
Catherine, do you want to go first?
Oh, I'm happy for you too, Phil. Go for it. You know that
Okay.
we're 2 facilitators, don't you? There you go already. You go, Phil. There you go.
We're already creating a safe space. Isn't that wonderful? So, yeah, it's a good question. And this session made me reflect on what it is and isn't, which is a good thing. And I would say, for me, in my practice, it's about helping people and groups work better together so they can achieve an optimal solution to a problem or an opportunity. And I guess tonight we could be focusing more on the problem side of the equation, but it is about opportunity as well. And I would view it as an investment in guidance and navigation in a process so that you lower the costs and frictions in achieving that optimal outcome. Another point that did come up in a pre-discussion was, is a facilitator always neutral? And I think that's a difficult one to answer, because I'd say in the process, in the room or in the situation they're in, they're generally independent and they have to act transparently in order to get buy-in and trust from everyone involved in the process. But I would say as a facilitator, I'm always brought in by a sponsor, and that you are always thinking about what's the objectives of the sponsor here, what are they trying to achieve, and you have to be accountable to someone. So it's a really interesting conversation to have about whether a facilitator is neutral or not. And you're not always there to be liked necessarily when you're in the room. We all love to be liked when we're speaking or facilitating, but it's not always in your remit to be liked by everyone. And maybe just a final point I'll make before Catherine chimes in is, I think it's definitely needed, because everyone, when we come into a situation, especially say a disaster, we have our own unique view of it, and we have our own unique challenges. We have our own unique attributes and circumstances in our own lives, and we have different incentives and different things at stake in the process. So I think it's always hard for one person to see that complete picture. And the facilitator, I think, is really there to help everyone build that picture, to see what the picture is, and then respond and go forward with that full picture in mind.
Mm. Thanks, Phil. Catherine.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Phil. I would agree with many of the comments there, and I've just noted things down there, Phil, so thanks. And to add to that, I think from my perspective that facilitation is very much about creating a space for people to connect and to create and build relationships with one another. So I think that's a huge part of the facilitation process, is to help people to see each other as people, that human-centeredness of things. And I probably in a disaster or crisis, it's very easy to maybe forget that at the heart of everything are people. And there's probably a lot of emotion around the place. So, you know, working with people in that way to remember that as decisions are being made, that the decisions are actually being made about people and other sentient beings that are also included potentially in that crisis situation. So how do we hold our humanity in all of that? And sometimes to maybe have somebody who is not so deeply entrenched in the situation who can hold the space. So it brings me to that idea of a facilitator being able to hold the space for people and to be able to do some of those things like make decisions, get clarity, to be able to you know, create awareness around what is actually going on, and to use one of those adaptive leadership terminologies, getting on the balcony and having a, you know, a perspective on things, and then sort of getting on the dance floor and being able to get into the detail as well. So I think there's a range of things, and a couple of references that I'd like to pull into that too. Two people, well, there's a lot of facilitators here tonight too that I have great regard for and respect for, that I've learned a lot from, and the way that they go about their facilitation, and I'm sure they would have lots to say about this as well. And two people that one is Adam Kahane and the work that he's been doing around facilitation and talking about facilitating breakthrough and things like that. And I think his work is speaks to a lot of this, and how you actually help people to create a breakthrough on situations. And also I'd like to just acknowledge Thomas Lantala, who's here tonight as well. And he's recently written a paper, and there's in his paper, there's this paragraph that really resonates for me. And I think this is where it dawned on me, you know, sometimes you have to see this stuff in black and white to go, yes, yes, yes. And so Thomas wrote this paragraph that says, facilitators are constantly navigating uncertainty. Every workshop, seminar, or training session is unique and consists of unforeseen elements and participants' personalities. Their work is to create and handle dynamic spaces where people interact, engage, and create. And so I think that's at the heart of what we do as facilitators. And then if we can bring those skills and transfer that into a crisis situation and hold the space for people to bring their individual and creative capacity in order to be able to cooperate and collaborate and build bridges, I think that's where there's a lot of strength to be had from having a facilitator, a crisis facilitator involved.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. And I think it's only proper that we'd throw to you, Thomas. This is, as Catherine said, Thomas has written an article called Crisis Management Needs Facilitators. So the apparent dilemma that we're discussing tonight is, does facilitation have a role in disaster management? I suspect that Thomas might have a fairly firm view on that. But, so what are your thoughts, Thomas?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the appreciation. This was very much a surprise for me. I enjoyed really listening to the panelists, because many of the things that were said really resonate with me, and also the opinion that I stand for. I mean, I've worked between the spheres now for a long period of time, and I have seen there's so many overlaps between, on the one hand, what's expected of people managing disasters or crisis. There's difference between the two, but I like to pretty much focus on the commonalities, which is making decisions, finding creative solutions, handling human dynamics and people as such. I'm also very much a believer in human-centered crisis management, which is, as Catherine also said, people are at the core of it. They're affected by it, and they have to handle it, and they have to find solutions, and they have to make decisions. And yes, there's a situation that needs to be managed, but it will ultimately always be people who do it, and that's where the facilitation comes in, because that's a key part of it. It's dealing with human dynamics. It's finding creative solutions. It's using tools to maybe break creativity, not least, right? Break mental blockades. And in crisis management, there's periods, there's phases, and at different phases you need different tools. So having someone who can actually have an outside view a little bit, not necessarily needs to be even neutral, but just have this outside perspective on it and say maybe this process tool or maybe this approach would work right now, is actually on the one hand an added value. On the other hand, I believe a strong relief on the crisis managers, because they have to handle all of that. They're responsible for running the meetings. They're responsible for making a process. And if you have somebody from the outside who can take that burden off, it's already a huge relief, because you can focus on well, the numerous other things you have to manage. So I strongly believe that facilitators could have a very crucial role, and really contribute to crisis and disaster management.
Thank you, Thomas. In your experience, your Northern Hemisphere experience, is that a hard message to push? If the apparent dilemma that we're talking about tonight, in the disaster management or crisis management is often seen as a top-down sort of directive leadership sort of model, is this concept of including a facilitator or another independent view, is it a hard message to sell, or what's your experience?
Well, it depends on when you sell this message, I'd say, because of course, when there's a crisis going on, people might not be so receptive for this idea. But if you have discussions with experts like yourselves here today, I think there's an openness, there's a curiosity about the idea, and there's also an understanding that could happen. But what I face a lot is the question: well, how should this look in practice? So how should we do this? Right? And I think that's where the thinking needs to come in, because what you do not want in a crisis or a disaster is even more questions and unknowns than what the context already presents you with. So if somebody comes in and say, well, I can support you, but you have no idea how that's going to look, you might immediately be dismissive of the idea because you don't have the time to deal with that right now, there and then. But I think once the experience that I've made, and I have had these roles, right? I've also taken these roles upon myself, both as a crisis manager and as someone facilitating processes in these situations. I think it was always received very, very positively. But of course, it requires a change of mindset. It requires a little bit of daring and a little bit of also maybe in these exercises, simulations that you do sometimes beforehand to try out how this works, both for crisis managers and crisis teams, just as much as for crisis facilitators, because that's also that's a different way of facilitating. You're confronted with a lot of emotional responses, including your own, which is not always easy. So I think there's also experience required on the level of the facilitator.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a wonderful segue into the next part. When you said there that the question is how do we do this in practice? How does that actually look? What's it look like in reality? And that's exactly what I hope we're going to be talking about over the next 30 minutes in our small breakout group. So thank you for that beautiful unscripted segue into the next session. So I'll just share the screen shortly, and we'll talk about a scenario that we might use for our small group discussions. And this scenario was emailed out yesterday to people, but as I said before, if you haven't had a chance to look at that, that's fine. And before we move into that, I just would like to acknowledge that beautiful artwork there was done by one of our panelists, Catherine. We had the panel members and myself had a bit of a planning meeting, and Mike was sipping his tea with a beautiful cup, and Catherine loves teacups, and she decided to spend a bit of time after that doing this beautiful artwork, which we thought is sort of quite befitting of our group here, because we're sitting on the sideline sipping a cup of tea. We're not in the middle of a disaster. We're just sitting, musing and contemplating. So it was a perfect addition to the slide pack. So thank you, Catherine. The scenario that we're going to use, though, is about a Queensland town called Milton. It's situated on a river in regional Queensland. It's a small farming community. It's got a history of flooding. Council owns a dam that's upstream. It was about 30 years old, this dam, and it's been built to mitigate flood risks. So when you go into your breakout rooms, you and your breakout room companions are gun facilitators from a city group called Facilitation Plus, and you've been engaged by the council to assist them with their disaster management activities. So that's the broad overview. We're breaking this up into the areas that Mike talked about before in terms of before, during and after. So the before component of the scenario is that council regularly reviews every year or so. It reviews its plans to make sure they're still relevant. So then the longer sort of the distant before, the plans get reviewed. But last week we had 400 mils of rainfall in the catchment areas around Milton. The rivers and creeks are starting to overflow, as are the weirs in the river. And the dam is also starting to overtop. And there is some discussion amongst some of the engineers that if this continues, it could result in a dam failure. So that's the before component. And some of you will go into rooms to be looking at the before components. Some of you will be looking at the during components, and the during components at 10 o'clock this morning, the disaster committee meets to review the situation. At 4 o'clock this afternoon, the cracks in the dam wall have started to appear and residents in low-lying areas have been ordered to evacuate. At 6 p.m, the dam wall does eventually fail and half the town is flooded, and the water treatment facility is disabled, and half the town is also without power. So that's the during component. Some of you will be looking at the after component. So the scenario for the after component is that the flooded residents are taking shelter at the airport. We've got insurance companies that are pretty slow to the party. We've got the local school is flooded and damaged. We've got tradespeople are pretty hard pressed. There's not many of them in town, and not enough for the repairs that are needed. And a number of businesses are yet to reopen. So our before, during and after challenges, we are from Facilitation Plus, and some groups will be looking at the before, some looking at the during, and some looking at the after. In your group, your role is to discuss those three questions there, or those three issues. Could facilitation add value here? And if so, how? Picking up on Thomas's point from before, how does it actually work in reality? What facilitation challenges might you encounter in this context, and what skills and techniques might you use in this context? So there's some fairly meaty issues to talk through there. I'll just stop sharing there to see if there are any questions from people. And Jamie has set up the breakout rooms. Jamie, is that right? We're all set to go.
Ready to go.
And in the chat, we've got the questions to be asked. Now, does each breakout room know whether there are before or a during or an after, Jamie?
I've got that labelled. Almost. I'll just rename those right now. So room 1 is going to be a before. Room 2 is going to be a during, and room 3 is going to be after, and then we just follow that for 4, 5 and 6. But I'll just put those titles in right now.
Okay, while you're doing that, are there any questions from people? Phil?
Just clarifying, looking at the timeline, we've got about 20 minutes, I think, for the discussion.
Yeah, about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. And we'll call you back after that. Raise your hand if you've got any questions before we go. All good. Okay.
I have one just comment to make, Graham. Those that do the before element of the exercise should consider a lot of thought goes into I think the first dot point about the disaster management arrangements,
right.
Because that's probably more relevant to the facilitation process than what the exercise is about, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense?
Not really. Can you tell us again?
Can you go back to the first? Can you go back to the before?
Oh, I'm not sharing now, right? Or
no, you're not sharing. Can you share it? Can you share it?
I'll share the screen. Yep, and I'll just go back to before. Yeah. There we go. Yep.
Okay, so council regularly reviews its disaster management plans. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm probably providing the answer before everyone sort of got to discuss it, but like a lot of consideration on that first dot point rather than on the 3 following dot points, if that makes any sense.
All right. So where's facilitation?
I'll explain why after all of this is.
All right. Okay, we're right to go.
We are right to go. I'll open rooms. We'll go for 20 minutes, folks, and it'll give you a 60-second warning. Hope you enjoy that. Enjoy that discussion, and you've got some group leads. So Brad in group 1, Mike in group 2, which is during, after Catherine, before is Phil, during is Andrew Huffer, and after is Patrick Byrne. So I'll start those rooms. Enjoy it.
Here we go. I think everyone's back in town. So welcome back, folks. I think I'd have to apologise for saying sorry about the short time because we always run out of time in these breakout discussions. But I hope there was some valuable discussions that were had there. We might just spend 15 minutes or so just feeding back from each group. We might just go around the grounds and just ask each group what were the 2 key issues that might have come out of the discussions. We might start with your group, Brad, if you wouldn't mind. So you were a before group. So over to you,
yes,
Brad,
we were.
or someone you want to nominate from your group.
So we had 4 of us in the breakout, and I know Simon, you're struggling with your voice tonight, but certainly Linda or Tim, feel free to jump in. We certainly, it was clear to us that facilitation is not only valued but needed in the before phase, and I think there were quite a number of challenges we were dealing with there in that before phase, not the least of which is the somewhat disparate or different approaches to the governance of, the provision of disaster and crisis management services and responses in places like the United States, where Tim is from, and also, of course, here in our own fair country in Australia, where Linda represents local government in southeast Queensland. So, I mean, you've got these different kinds of contexts. One thing that really jumped up toward the end of our conversation was a metaphor, which was that of an orchestra conductor, where the facilitator can bring a degree of structure, if you will, a degree of certainty to a process that brings voice to people who are potentially going to be impacted by a future event. And we felt that there was potentially also some value in bringing people from outside that community, so an external facilitator to provide who's less connected with the community. And then we made the sort of parenthetical comment, which was if you are during and after the after piece, for example, you'd want someone potentially engaged with the community, someone local. So there was all those kinds of thoughts being thrown around. When it came to the tool set, skill set we thought might be useful would be a facilitator who brings a very clear outward mindset to helping that community, whether it's reviewing disaster management planning and preparation or whatever it might be, an outward mindset, and very importantly, a dialogue skill set or a dialogue tool set. So being able to use dialogue, we're creating that safe space for an inclusive contribution from all the stakeholders. Anyway, I'm going to keep it short like that, unless Tim or Linda want to add anything to it.
Yep, all good for me.
Can I just ask, Brad, what's an outward mindset? Just in
it's being alive to the goals, objectives, needs, and aspirations of other people. So rather than focused on self or focused on a very narrow view, you have a very expansive view that includes other people, and you're fundamentally helpful to those other people as they prepare potentially for a response to crisis or disaster.
Thank you. Okay, I love the metaphor of the orchestra and being the orchestra conductor, I guess, the facilitator's role there. So you having a facilitator in the room potentially make sure we've got a beautifully tuned orchestra as opposed to a bunch of preschoolers with tambourines and drum kits. Thank you. Love to hear from Phil's group too. You were a before group.
We were before, yes. So two key areas to talk about, and we had a great geographical representation here. We had Hong Kong, Philippines, and Australia. So thanks to Alex, Alice, Jan, and we lost Christine and Michael early on. So apologies, I don't think it was us. Apologies for that. The first point I guess we talked about was the facilitator's role before is really about enabling collaboration and helping people have a voice in the process of designing, training, preparing how to mobilize resources and really getting, especially that community engagement piece and getting the community involved. So that would be one focus around that enabling the collaboration piece before. And the second one, hopefully Mike will give us a gold star for this one, I'm expecting it, is around the simulation and role-playing piece. So that can be anything from very, I guess, structured drills through to very more open simulation and scenario processes. And I guess just a couple of the key challenges identified there was one, sometimes you have a leader who's in a role in those processes and the simulation process can help them realize that maybe they don't have all the answers, and the facilitator can help not tell them what to do, but help guide them and coach them through the process. So not giving them the answers, but helping them discover the answers. And I think the other key thing that came up from the group was in that simulation exercise, making sure everyone has a voice. And I would say it's an appropriate voice because not everyone has an equal role to play in a disaster. But just making sure in those simulations, everyone gets an opportunity to play to the role that they would need to play in a real situation. So I think that's it mainly from us, Graham.
Thank you very much, Phil. So from both of the before groups, the arrow is very much pointing to, yes, facilitation does have a role in the before phase of disaster and crisis management. And for I guess for obvious reasons, yeah, the reviewing of the plans, but the governance arrangements will present potential problems depending on what those might be.
Graham, if I may, Graham, just before we go ahead, mate, there's one thing we did talk at some length about, and I failed to mention the word proximity. And Tim and Linda and Simon will remember we talked quite a degree about the word proximity, and what we mean by that is how close we are to the potential event. So if you're a year away, you might take a slightly different approach and have a slightly different kind of context for a facilitated workshop or event or engagement with stakeholders and community, etc., than if there's an imminent event. It's literally around the corner in days and weeks, as opposed to it's months and years out. So I think proximity is also a fairly important factor in that before element. Thanks, mate.
Okay, that's a good point. So really, the proximity issue, when you've got a lot of time, you're having your tea out of Catherine's beautiful teacup, fine china teacup. If it's close to the event, you'd be dealing with a keep cup probably.
Well, I'd be scoffing the tea cakes. I'd be getting the tea cakes into your mouth very quickly.
Okay. Okay.
Shoveling
fast.
But
thank you. Let's hear from the during groups. Mike's group. Does facilitation have a role? If so, how? What are some of the roadblocks or the challenges? What did you talk about? What were two key issues you discussed?
Mike, you're on mute.
Hello. Susan, do you want to start that discussion off?
I'm happy to. I think that we talked a lot about the during as being a high pressure time, that there's decisions to be made in a short period of time. Things are going quite wildly around the place. And we talked about, who should be in the room, who are the people who should be there. And in most disaster situations, the people in the room at that time are the decision makers. It's probably more of a command and control structure. But we actually talked about the importance of facilitation in being a facilitative leader in that situation. It's unlikely to be an external person. It's more likely to be someone within the chain of command who has facilitation skills, who can avoid the group think and actually make sure that people are considering scenarios, considering consequences, and making sound, well-rounded decisions, even though they're under time pressure. So there's probably two ways things could go. One is to the action man, action man, action man. I'm gendering it, shouldn't be. Or there is the person who wants to say, hold up, we've got it. And in a command structure, you've got to be able to enable all voices to feel safe to speak. That there may be someone who is outside of that direct command structure but actually has a view and needs to be able to speak. So probably more facilitative management than an external person at that time, but really with the skills and techniques to create safety in the room, ensure all voices are heard and that consequences are considered.
Spot on.
Thank you, Susan. I can see why you threw to Susan there, Mike. No offence to you.
No, she right across it, and it's about delegation.
That's right. Well, that's right. So, Susan, the point you've brought in there is the issue of facilitative leadership. You don't necessarily need, in this situation you're proposing, if I understand you correctly, you don't necessarily have to have a, well, if you haven't got a separate independent facilitator, you really need this facilitative approach to leadership in as much as engaging people, ensuring that you garner all, if you've got the time, you garner all ideas and take people along the journey.
I think it's about, there's a lot of self-awareness in that. So we tend to go to what we know best, which in a disaster, if you're a person who knows the plan, prepared to give directions, lead other people, you might tend to go to telling, where there is a bit inside, that awareness side, that has to say, am I hearing? Have I heard around the table? Have we considered consequences? So there's a lot of pressure on that person who's in that facilitative role. And I can tell you sometimes I've actually seen it where they've got no self-awareness. That's straight to command and control without that facilitated approach. But we also considered...
Emergency service people tend to do that a lot. It's like the pilot in the plane when the engines are gone, and the story of the BOAC plane flying over the volcano eruption in Indonesia many years ago, where he knew what he had to do, but he sat on his hands and he went through the processes with his co-pilot and in his head several times before he made the decision. So it's a similar thing here, whereas don't make the decision until you consider all of the external influences that may affect you. So listen to the people that are talking rather than making a decision yourself.
Thank you. That's a beautiful distinction, that issue of facilitative approach to leadership. Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate that. We might move on to the other juring group, Andrew Hopper and Co.
Yep, we had the dream team with us from Norway, Bali, Brisbane and Perth. What a crew.
Wow.
My goodness. Sounds like you were on a holiday.
Pretty much. Every day's a holiday. Come on. Yeah, similar. Ours was a yes and, so building on what the previous guys talked about. I guess some of our observations, and other people in this group throw in as well. Some of it was the basics of keeping people just focused on the task. And the other part was being really clear on what our role is. And like I said, this team is probably going to be a team that's ready to go, familiar with each other. So we need to be clear, do we need to have a really proactive level of facilitation? Or are we at the back of the room advisory type of role, helping the leader to work through that process, similar to what Susan mentioned, make sure that self-awareness is there, they're following the process and the questions are being asked. And the thing that Wildy threw in there is for people to be really clear on what's the biggest threats, which is, that's kind of clear-ish, but where are the potential opportunities as well. I think that's where the opportunity for a facilitator to come in is to throw that, or to make sure those questions are being considered and tackled from different perspectives. Probably the other big thing that come out, in addition to being really clear on our mandate and role, was, Stephen brought up the fact that he'd seen self-organising really come out quite strongly in the recent floods in Brisbane, and his work in disaster management in hospitals in India. So our role then again is to think about, well, how can we assist that? And in some cases, as facilitators, just get out of the frigging way and let it happen, and have that real facilitating role, where perhaps our role is a resourcing role, or ensuring there's good communication throughout the group, or that the ultimate decision makers understand the gravity of the situation so they can pour the resources in that's needed. So I've done a bit of interpretation of what our team said, but if there's anyone that wants to chuck extras in, please do so.
Anyone from Andrew's team? So those two juring groups paint a different picture by the look of it, from my point, from my perception anyway. It's yes, facilitation has a role in the juring, but it's a different shape, different model of facilitation than in the before bit, which is interesting. So you've got that, Susan was saying, that sort of command and control mindset. So perhaps a facilitative approach to that would be helpful. And Andrew's group were talking about, facilitators helping getting people clear on the role, and having that alternative view, looking at opportunities as well as threats. So yes, it's a different shape of facilitation. Thank you. Can we have some feedback from the after groups now? Patrick, you were in one of the after groups. What is facilitation have a role there?
Yes, absolutely. And what was interesting from our viewpoint was that there was 3 of our group who were actually engaged in work in emergency management, all in the sort of local area to Brisbane or the southeast of Queensland. And we had one person who was a facilitator. So it was quite an interesting context to draw the 2 threads, if you like, together. I think there's a recognition that already, particularly at the the after stage, there's a significant amount of facilitation already occurring, probably informally rather than formally and untrained, as opposed to somebody who's trained as such. But there's a recognition that it already exists. They loved particularly the words human-centeredness, which I think was talked about before, which was really sort of so important in the aftermath of a traumatic event, and relationships were so important. So facilitating those relationships was critical. I think the second thing that we perhaps recognised was that at that stage of the event, command and control was less valuable. It was more about learning from the different people on the ground what the needs were, how they were going to address those needs, and not just looking to what could be done now, but thinking further ahead for perhaps potentially years to get that the community back on its feet again and address the issues that we spoke about. So I think the 2 key points from our viewpoint probably would be about relationships and human-centeredness, and the second thing is at that stage of the thing we're talking about looking ahead, working collectively with the individual groups and looking further ahead rather than just the sort of next week or 2.
Thank you, Patrick. And Catherine, what did your group? You're an after group as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of points that resonate similar to the after group as well. So yes, definitely relationships are key, those networks, and also recognizing that people in the community would, you know, potentially have those networks. So how do you tap into those networks and harness the skills and capabilities of the people around you? One of the things we talked about is how to establish, you know, establishing trust, and how important that is as well for the facilitator. And that might be for the person who's in the community and has skills and capabilities, and or maybe you're working alongside if you're coming in as an external person. There was a comment, and I just want to acknowledge the people in the group. There was Stephen McGuinness, I think, McInnes, and Marg, and Christine, and Hogan, and Michael as well. So all of these points were sort of an amalgamation of everything that we talked about. And one of the things that came up about unintended consequences. So being really mindful that's, you know, often people want action, you know, they want things to happen, and getting frustrated, and being mindful that yes, action needs to happen, but there can be unintended consequences if some of the things haven't been thought through properly, and then conflict can happen as well. So that kind of pausing for a while, and also recognizing the high emotion that's there and the triggers. So holding the space for that grief to actually be there, and acknowledging that and recognizing that. And also proximity came up. How soon afterwards is all this happening? And the roles and responsibilities that a facilitator probably doesn't have a lot of authority, because there may be authorities around the place, but it's that recognizing who's got, I guess, who's got the ear of people in some respects too, you know. Christine's been doing a lot of work in her local community, and just talked about the power of that network, and how, you know, that official channels may actually not be reaching people in the same way that the community channels do in that regard. So that, and then that forward planning came up as well, and recognizing the complex space that we're in. And then, of course, we talked about, I don't know if people have seen it, but the People's Republic of Malakuta, that's been a series on TV a while ago, and it's a really powerful example of community in action, and trust or not, and how all of that happens. But I just want to acknowledge too, that's about that letting, with a facilitator, sometimes getting out of the way and letting people self-organize, and maybe all we need to do is be the tea maker and make cups of tea for people as well, so they can get on and do what they need to do.
Thank you. The tea comes back into it again. So yes, again, facilitation has a role here in the recovery, or the after element. But again, it sort of takes another different shape and size. But yeah, that issue of the relationships and the trust coming back in here, and about engagement and bringing people along. So it seems that the sort of the before bit and the after bit sort of might be a little bit similar in terms of the look and feel of the facilitation. The middle bit, the during bit, can be a bit cut and thrust and a bit busy, and the command and control sort of might take precedence there. But I guess if I could be bold enough to do a wrap on the discussion in general, in terms of the premise that we've been looking at, it does facilitation have a role in disaster management? Looks like the resounding answer to that is yes. It does take different shapes and different sizes depending on the time and the circumstance, and you know, it can be fairly directive, or it can be quite subtle. I just see in one of the chats there that you don't have to own the room, you know, as a facilitator. You very much can very much be in the background and just be a quiet guiding force. Thank you very much for that feedback from the breakout rooms. I'd like to just open it up to the floor, because that may well, those discussions that we've just had may well have prompted someone's thought process that they'd like to share. So would anyone like to share their thoughts on what we've just heard?
Yeah, Graham, I do. Sorry. Sorry,
Good on you,
I was
Kayleen.
just resonating on what Catherine had said around that facilitation, but it may be just to help people have that cup of coffee. But I think the facilitation component is actually to build that self-help, basically to help those individual community groups and such to continue when the camera stops rolling. The community still has to keep going forward. There will come a time where that recovery piece will move away, and it's about making sure that there is momentum, confidence in the momentum for communities to move forward. So I think facilitation, the expertise of facilitation with the right expertise in recovery will actually assist those communities to continue forward. And in our group discussion, there was some really good discussion around with Vicky around the diversity of her community groups in the local area, and it's around making sure that you've got that momentum for those groups to continue, and also to know how to reach back in if they need help, but have built that confidence and trust so that the community can keep moving forward. Anyhow, that's my little comment.
Thank you.
I am not a facilitator, by the way.
Can I just add
Thanks.
to that, Graham, to Kayleen's comment? Just that relationship beforehand is the absolute. So that's where we kind of spoke about, Catherine, at the beginning, talking about that human-centeredness, because that's where it all starts. And as a disaster management person in a local government area, I can't build all those relationships. So I've got to find who's got the key, who's got the link. So having a community resilience officer in a community development team, having a business resilience officer in an economic development team, suddenly my link out is reaching so much more. My community resilience officer has the link to the First Nations. They have a link to the CALL community. My business has a link to small businesses, industries. So from my small patch, I can now reach so many more. So that relationship in the before is what makes us, you know, understand what we need to do in the after. The during, the lights and sirens and the, you know, that will all happen under chain of command. It has to happen. It has to happen. In the before and in the recovery, people are time poor. They don't have the time. So it's particularly, and I've done before, during and after in my years in disaster management. And in my opinion, it's the recovery, it's the after that needs the facilitation, because you've got to, people are too time poor. You've got to get them motivated to get the actions happening for the community, to get the community moving forward for the next event. Thank you.
That's beautiful, Vicky, and thank you, Kayleen. So this issue of relationships and humanness is really a strong theme that's coming through. And in answer, you know, or in debating the question, does facilitation have a role? From what you're saying, Vicky, not only does it have a role, it's actually just inherent. It's just an inherent bit in the role. As we heard before, you don't have to have a formal facilitator. Facilitation can be informal, and facilitation can be just partly a facilitative approach to leadership. So it doesn't have, you don't have to have a separate independent person with a name badge saying facilitator. It's just an inherent part of that humanness and that's required in this, particularly as you're saying, in recovery. I'm going to ask Thomas again, and I hate to put you in the spotlight, Thomas, but I've seen your TEDx talk, so I'm gathering you don't mind. Well, you're used to being in the spotlight, at least in those instances. So, what have you're a and obviously an advocate of facilitation in crisis management. What's come through tonight, or sorry, in this session for you? And have you got any comment on some of the comments that have been made?
Oh, I mean, this is a wonderful discussion. I think it's an important one, and I think it just is again builds bridges between the two sectors, which I think are anyway there, but we just have to walk across them. I think what is the key is that that both sides, in a way, a bit what Vicky just said, right? So I was in the during group, which was interesting because on the one hand, this opens the most options for facilitation. On the other hand, is also probably the most difficult one, because things are going, things have to happen, things a bit what Vicky just said, right? It's also a bit chaos, and we want to have order in the chaos. But I think this is where the whispers can come in, and these skills of facilitation. It doesn't have to be a person, as you also said right now, but it can be like if you have people who simply divide tasks, like as timekeeping or as documentation, or that it doesn't all end with one person, but you just these small things, right? That you have a bit of an overview and a bit of a bird view on the situation helps. And I think facilitation is often just skills. Doesn't always have to be a role. So I think we can also simply promote and get more into that sector by training, educating, and entering maybe simulations through skill development when it comes to facilitation and handling human dynamics.
Thank you, Thomas. That's a beautiful a nuance. You know, it's not about people, it's about the skills, and that's really, I think, encapsulates what we've been hearing tonight. So thank you. Any other final comment before we wrap it up?
Can I just say something quickly? Just to tie up to everyone's thread here. We can't be not a single person can be everything to everybody. So we really need to know our community and the skill sets in our community. And that is what Vicky is talking about. That is the preparation. Know your people first.
Can I just pick up on that too? Because to me, that's all about the health and well-being of your community, you know, and really harnessing that and helping people to the community be as healthy and well. And I mean that in a very holistic way, that they, you know, have the relationships are robust and good, you know, that there's a sense of resilience there, that the networks are there, that the trust is there. And the more that we actually spend time in that space and building that in different sorts of ways, then when the crisis actually hits, we've got, you know, this kind of fitness for it in some respects. We've been training and readying ourselves for potentially that crisis that happens.
Graham, there's a question from Mark as well. Mark Pixley, just very briefly.
I just wanted to thank you for arranging this conversation. I also want to let you know that there have been colleagues in the IEF having discussions about creating up a SIG, special interest groups around facilitation in disaster and crisis. And the idea is that we get people who are interested or involved in this type of facilitation to talk and share approaches and understandings. So if any of you are interested in that, I'd be pleased to welcome you into the conversation, and you can reach out to me.
Mark, can you put your email address in the chat, please, just so people can contact you?
Certainly.
Thank you.
I think Christine's got a point too, Christine Hogan.
Hi, it was just one of the things about building trust and connections. And one of the things I mentioned in the after group is that I've run quite a few sessions in a games room under the house, bringing in our local neighbours. We live beside the river and we've got a lot of trees with fire risk. So I run workshops underneath the house and invite the local City of Swan, the fire brigade and all the other people. I've managed to get more people to that with a glass of wine than going to formal meetings at the City of Swan. And the other thing was the Swan River, which is beautiful, ran through the bottom of my garden one year. And I begged the City of Swan, and we had a close shave, right? I begged the City of Swan to run a workshop quickly. They took 5 months. How many people turned up to that workshop? Guess? 3. Myself, my husband, and my next door neighbour. Everybody stayed away. 5 months later, people have gone on to other stuff. When we did a community meeting in the hills just after the fires, the people who lived on the edge of the fires turned up in their droves. We ran it straight away, and it was like the fire missed us, but we weren't prepared. And 60 odd people turned up immediately. So there's something about building on the edge of a disaster, time-wise, and acting quickly, not waiting for when people have got other business going on. There's a sense of urgency just after an emergency, especially a local one, let alone something terrible that we've witnessed in Queensland as well. Okay.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. Now that's facilitation in action. You might not have considered yourself as a facilitator in that point, but that's exactly what, from what you said, that's exactly what you were doing. That is wonderful. Folks, the time is always going to be our enemy, and that's the case tonight. So I will call the session to a close, but I just want to thank everyone who's been involved. I particularly want to thank our panel members. Wonderful insights and kicked us off there and leading your discussions in the groups. Thank you very much. Jamie Nichols, the co-pilot, who did an awesome job helping me in the Zoom, and particularly all of you who've joined us. It's a wonderful. I mean, if we're talking about humanness, it's a wonderful humanist experience to be connecting with people from the other side of the globe in group discussions like this. And so I cannot thank you enough for those internationals who joined us for our evening here in Australia. So thank you very much.
Especially 2 a.m. in the morning too.
Yeah, I was going to say the good news for Tim is you can go to bed now. It's what, 3:30 in the morning or something in Albuquerque. Thank you very much for blessing us with your presence.
Thanks, Graham, for hosting too.
Yeah, thank you, Graham.
My pleasure.
Can I also just quickly mention the word facilitation in action? Brad reminded me of what's coming up in May of next year, which is the IAF Oceania conference. Brad, do you want to say something very briefly on that?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Look, ever so briefly, we are running an in-person conference in Australia. It'll be in Canberra at this stage in May of next year, 2023, and we'd love to have visitors from across the globe come and join us, and around our fair country as well, and across our region of Oceania. So welcome. Keep an eye on the Oceania webpage on the IAF website. So if you go to www.iaf-world, .org/Australia. You can see the actual link sitting inside the chat at the moment. I placed it in there a little bit while back. So it says chapters, it goes site chapters Australia chapter. Anyway, you'll navigate your way on iafworld.org, and we'll be posting on that all the information you need to come and join us in May of next year. Thanks, Jamie. And thank you very much, Graham. Brilliant job, mate. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Brad. Lovely to have a final word from our sponsor. So thank you very much, Brad. Wish you all very well. And I thank you so much for being part of it. I think we've answered the question. Yes, facilitation does have a role in disaster management and crisis management. And Thomas, I think you've got a whole band of now colleagues who are certainly on the same page as you. So thank you all very much for your input and wish you all well.